My name is Subarno Chattarji. I teach in the Department of English, University of Delhi. And I'm going to speak today about this idea called the American dream, which all of us are familiar with. It's a phrase that exists in everyday conversation in commonsensical terms. It's an overarching commonplace notion which relates to this idea of America as a place of possibility, as a place of individual freedom, as a place for success and plenty. And for instance, we could trace it back to Hector St. John de Crevecoeur's question, what is an American? To, say, in popular culture, Simon and Garfunkel's song about they all come to look for America. So there is in this ideation of the American dream a sense of futurity, on which, of course, America is premised. Now, I'm not really interested in the commonsensical idea, although that is important and I might come back to it. And I'm not going to consider the genealogy of the term. What I'm interested in are the implications and the afterlife of this term. And I'm going to try and root this, as it were, through discussions of various texts, which, as it happens, are taken up chronologically, but that is purely accidental. Let me start with Hector St. John de Crevecoeur, Letters from an American Farmer. Now, as you probably know, Crevecoeur was neither a farmer nor an American, but he thought that it would be a good idea to write these letters talking about his experiences in America. And what you see by and large, apart from letter 9, where he talks about the awful aspect of slavery, a runaway slave who is now in a cage and is having his eyes picked out by a bird, what you primarily see is optimism. And in that letter 3, he asks the seminal question, what then is an American? What is this new man? And the primary distinction that he seems to be making is a distinction from Europe. Yeah? Here there are no kings, there are no classes, there is no aristocracy, and so on and so forth. So it is, again, in the fable of Andrew the Hebridean, what he seems to be articulating is this endless possibility that you can be anyone, you can come from anywhere, it doesn't matter, America is the great leveler, and you can achieve your American dream. Now, by the time, as I said earlier, by the time of letter 9, Crevecoeur has seen some of the aspects of what it means to be black in America. And some of the authors that I'm going to deal with today, not just authors actually, because I'm going to refer to a poem which you're familiar with by Langston Hughes, Dream Deferred, James Baldwin, but also Martin Luther King and Barack Obama. So the way in which black identity, African American identity, inflects a very different kind of notion of what it means to be an American and what then the American dream means. But before that, let me just begin with Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience, 1849, first published as Resistance to Civil Government, as you know. Now, Thoreau makes several very important and crucial interventions regarding the relationship between the citizen and the government. And one very obvious point, let me just read out this. The idea, of course, that you know now from Benedict Anderson and his successors about the imagining of the nation. How is the American nation brought into being? And much before Anderson, Thoreau writes, this American government, what is it but a tradition, though a recent one, endeavoring to transmit itself unimpaired to posterity, but each instant losing some of its integrity. So the idea that, like all national imaginaries, the American imaginary, the idea of the American dream on which the nation is imagined, is itself a fictional construct. It is a tradition. The invention of tradition is crucial to the stories that Americans will tell themselves and that Americans will tell the world, because it is in very crucial ways a mode of self-representation, but also a representation to the outside world. Then, as you recall, I'm not going to go into the details of the argument, but 2 or 3 quotations. Then he goes on to talk about how does it, as he says, become a man to behave towards this American government today? How is the citizen now going to relate to the government? And his reply, I answer that he cannot without disgrace be associated with it. I cannot for an instant recognize that political organization as my government, which is also the slave's government. Yeah? And my and slaves are italicized. Yeah? I cannot for an instant, recognize that political organization as my government, which is the slave's government also. He's making a very clear distinction. How is it that the American nation, which is predicated on this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the inalienable right, how is it that this government allows for slavery? Yeah? And he continues with this point a little later. In other words, when 1/6 of the population of a nation which is undertaken to be the refuge of liberty are slaves, and a whole country is unjustly overrun and conquered by a foreign army and subject to military law, I think that it is not too soon for honest men to rebel and revolutionize. Yeah? He's also, of course, as you know, talking about the Mexican-American War. But the point is that America is at one level the refuge of liberty, and at the same time 1/6 of its population have no rights at all. They are not citizens, they are not human beings, they are objects. And what Thoreau is pointing to here, of course, is the ethical rupture at the heart of America. The ethical rupture, the original sin that Toni Morrison talks about elsewhere. And this ethical rupture, I will argue, and I'm not unique in this, is at the heart of the imagining of the American dream. Yeah, then of course Thoreau goes on to talk about the majority of one and so on and so forth. But when you talk about the majority of one, of course, it might be useful here to take a detour before I go on to Langston Hughes, through Walt Whitman and Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. Now, Song of Myself, as you know, is not just the song of the poetic persona Walt Whitman, but it is the song of America. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume. And the democratic vistas that Whitman celebrates are, again, as you will recall, largely without blemish. America is a land of infinite possibility, and the landscape itself, the geographical landscape itself, is a means of articulating that endless possibility. So if Crèvecoeur is optimistic, Whitman takes that to another level. I mean, Whitman, of course, is not just talking about himself, as I said, but he is also the poet of America. Yeah? Because he is going to give the word. He is going to give the word. He is going to bring America into being, as it were. He is going to imagine America into being. And in that America, you remember that long catalogue where he talks about the president, the prostitute, the carpenter, and so on and so forth. It's an America united by its disparity, united, as the cliche goes, in diversity. Yeah? So that common notion of e pluribus unum takes on a poetic tenor here, as it were. Now, Whitman, of course, has his own complex problematics. In an essay by Jonathan Arak, the idea of the vernacular itself is critiqued, and that's something that you might wish to consider. Whitman was also deeply shocked by the Civil War because, and he has a long poem on this, everything that Whitman wrote was extremely long. But Drum Taps, which is the poem to the Civil War, is the point at which he finally has to come to terms with, in political terms, the fact of slavery and what it means. But again, he's going to provide you with an ameliorative ideological frame, because in "Oh Captain, My Captain," the paean to Lincoln, you have this idea that here is this outstanding historical man who has redeemed American promise. So American promise actually never really goes away. The dream is not only present and possible, the dream is accessible to everyone. Yeah? Now, from Whitman to Langston Hughes is a bit of a jump in terms of time, but more than time is Hughes's politics and the ideological frame within which Langston Hughes places the way in which Langston Hughes creates the idea of America and the American dream. Now, in What Happens to a Dream Deferred, he's referring to a very common political and ideological problem that the African American community faced. One of the things that they're told continually is that they must be patient, they must wait. And if they wait, the dreams will be fulfilled. And as you recall, at the end of the poem, of course, What Happens to a Dream Deferred, Hughes says, well, or does it just explode? Because what is articulated here is a particular kind of anger located within the individual as well as racial experience of being black. And anger here, and this will become much more evident when I talk about James Baldwin, anger not as just as an emotion, yeah? So I'm angry, I feel anger and so on and so forth, but anger in political terms. The political anger that you find in the writings of Hughes, Baldwin, in the speeches of, later speeches particularly, of Martin Luther King, and his contemporary, of course, Malcolm X. So that anger has a particular ideological terrain, and it has social impact. You are not just letting off steam. You are expressing in a particular language ideas and emotions which cannot be expressed in any other language. And language itself, therefore, is very crucial to the understanding of what the American dream means from an African American point of view. Because the frustration and the threat at the end of the poem, or does it just explode, is the frustration that the African American community had been living with ever since they were forcibly brought to the New World. And in many of his works, the next author that I want to sort of locate this idea of anger, but also of the notion of Americanness, if you will, is James Baldwin. Now, Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, published in 1963, the same year as Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And of course, as Baldwin says, it marks the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Yeah? And Baldwin takes up issues which are particular to the black community, but also essential, I would argue, for the understanding of this idea of America, what constitutes America. Now, as those of you who've read it will be familiar with the fact that it's actually two letters, yeah? Written to his nephew, also called James. And I'm just going to quote a few lines, few sentences from the first letter. And this is addressed to his nephew, as I said, his brother's son. And he tells him, "You were born where you were born and faced the future that you faced because you were black and for no other reason. The limits of your ambition were thus expected to be set forever. You were born into a society which spelled out with brutal clarity and in as many ways as possible that you were a worthless human being. You were not expected to aspire to excellence. You were expected to make peace with mediocrity. Wherever you have turned, James, in your short time on the earth, you have been told where you could go and what you could do and how you could do it, and where you could live and whom you could marry." Yeah? And then the passage continues. Yeah? The anger, of course, is obvious. But what is important is that he articulates what needs to be articulated. Yeah? And he nails the American lie that possibility is endless. Yeah? You faced what you faced because you were black and for no other reason. Yeah? You were expected to make peace with mediocrity. So this whole trajectory, yeah, that we are God's chosen people, the city upon a hill. Yeah? And that you can come from anywhere, you can be anyone, there is no class, we are not Europeans, and you can be a president. Yeah? So a peanut farmer like Jimmy Carter can become the president of the United States. Now that's the fulfillment of the myth, and I'll come back to this because Barack Obama inflects this myth in different ways. But for the blacks, that is not so. Yep. So as Baldwin says, writes, you were expected to make peace with mediocrity. And then he's going to reiterate something which is at the heart of the idea of the American dream. And he writes to his nephew, "Take no one's word for anything, including mine, but trust your experience. Know whence you came. There is really no limit to where you can go. There is really no limit to where you can go." Now, this idea of limitless possibility and opportunity is, of course, the stereotypical American dream. But in Baldwin's case, as you can see, not only is he reiterating it, but he is recontextualizing it. He's telling his black nephew, this black boy, that there is no limit to where you can go, that you do not have to put up with mediocrity, that you do not have to put up with racism and race. And then Baldwin is very conscious of the fact that it's not enough to think about race or racism in terms of personal experience. You have to think about it in structural terms. And he's going to bring in two terms which are, of course, very much a part of the debate around race and racism in the African American community. And this is what he writes. "Please try to remember that what they believe, as well as what they do and cause you to endure, does not testify to your inferiority, but to their inhumanity and fear. Please try to be clear, dear James, through the storm which rages about your youthful head today, about the reality which lies behind the words acceptance and integration. There is no reason for you to try to become like white people, and there is no basis whatever for their impertinent assumption that they must accept you. The really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. Now, the words integration and acceptance, of course, are crucial here, because there had been debates within the African American community, Booker T. Washington, for instance, talking about the need for integration and acceptance on the part of the white community, that blacks must integrate with the white community. And Baldwin is, of course, overturning that completely. It's not the whites who must accept the blacks, it's the blacks who must accept the whites. In any case, Baldwin's argument is, and this is central to the way in which the civil rights movement, his critique of the civil rights movement is structured, is that integration and acceptance, particularly integration, is representative of a white perspective. Integration and acceptance do not address structures of power, because at the heart of racial injustice in the United States and the problematics of the American dream is, of course, the structure of power, the ideological structures of power that enable race and racism to continue. And this is an issue, as I said earlier, at the heart of the civil rights movement, and even today. Because it's one thing, and very important, of course, I mean, it's not as if Baldwin is denying that. It's one thing to say that blacks must be treated as equal in public spaces, for instance. So, desegregation of schools and other public spaces, lunch counters, and so on and so forth. But that's only the way in which that kind of integration, according to Baldwin and many other critics, that kind of integration makes little difference to the structures of power that sustain racism. It allows for a sense of a country which is now united, which is equal, which treats everyone the same. The American dream is available to everyone, but of course it is not. And Martin Luther King, for instance, was aware of this. After the race riots in Watts in Los Angeles in 1965, King said to Bayard Rustin, who was a civil rights comrade of his, and I quote, "I worked to get these people the right to eat hamburgers. Now I have to do something to help them get the money to buy them." So now they can eat in integrated restaurants, but, just to paraphrase, they don't have the money. Yeah? So integrating schools, integrating lunch counters doesn't address, just to repeat, it doesn't address structural racism. Employment, poverty, education, home ownership, these are all indices available at the time of Martin Luther King and available today, which indicate that institutional and structural racism are still as valid today as they were in the 1960s. So the American dream means very different things to African Americans. Now, since I mentioned King, you are familiar with, and I would urge you to go onto YouTube and listen to Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. Because in Martin Luther King's speech there, he talks about biblical brotherhood. Yeah? A brotherhood where white and black and all colors are united in the fulfillment of the possibility of this American dream. Of course, King's attitude towards the idea of integration and acceptance as critiqued by Baldwin. King's ideas move closer to Baldwin's. For instance, by the time he moves to offer a scathing criticism of the Vietnam War. So what is important, at least in the I Have a Dream speech, is the fact that he taps into the dominant mythology of the United States. And he says that you have failed, you meaning the white community, the white Anglo-Saxon community that has created America, you have failed to keep your word. And he uses the idea of a check which is bounced, which is no value. So that if America is to live up to its ideals, well then give black people the rights of equality. And what is interesting, of course, is that the March on Washington was a march for jobs and employment. So he's also aware of the connections between race and labor and capital. Yeah? But at the end of it, as you know, and once you hear the speech, you'll get a sense. There is the sense of a futurity based not on the kind of futurity that Crèvecoeur had thought about, but a futurity of, as I said, biblical brotherhood. Now I want to move very quickly to Barack Obama, who made a speech in Philadelphia, March 18th, 2008, again available on YouTube, please have a look, where Obama takes up some of the issues that we've already dealt with regarding what it means to be an American, the idea of America itself, and the problem of race within that conceptualization of America. And he begins with a quotation, "We the people in order to form a more perfect union." So the definitive here, of course, is form, yeah? Processive. America as a work in progress in order to form a more perfect union. And then he goes on to say, 221 years ago in a hall that still stands across the street, a group of men gathered and with these simple words launched America's improbable experiment in democracy. Again, we're back to the idea of America. America's improbable experiment in democracy. Right? And in some ways, of course, Obama's right. Yeah? Because as you know, America is not formed on the basis of ethnicity, although arguably in some ways it is. It is in the American conceptualization of itself, white is not a color. Yeah? And therefore, white has no ideological charge, although white is the most ideologically charged color, as it were. But in many ways, Obama is right, as I said, because it is an improbable experiment. And Obama's own experience, as he says in the speech, is quite improbable. And then he goes on to say that he is convinced that America can work towards a better future. Again, the emphasis on futurity. And then he says, "This belief comes from my unyielding faith in the decency and generosity of the American people." In the decency and generosity of the American people. Now, these are complex contraries. Yeah? The ethical rupture at the heart of America that I mentioned with regard to Thoreau is what makes America much more complex. So, while he talks about decency and generosity, along with that decency and generosity is slavery, and there is genocide. Yeah? The Native American peoples who lost their land and their people. Obama then goes on to see himself as emblematic of the American promise. "I am married to a black American who carries within her the blood of slaves and slave owners. An inheritance we pass on to our two precious daughters. I have brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, uncles, and cousins of every race and every hue, scattered across 3 continents, and for as long as I live, I will never forget that in no other country on earth is my story even possible." Again, we return to one of the fundamental aspects of the American dream, which is exceptionality. We are different. We are special. In no other country on earth is my story even possible. Again, arguably true. We don't, for instance, yet have a black leader in, say, Europe. But that exceptionality seems to paper over certain other problematics of race. But it's not as if Obama is not conscious of this. He's too intelligent a man. And he talks about the structures of inequality. And he then goes on to mention something which has resonances from what Baldwin says about the refusal to be browbeaten into mediocrity. He talks about black anger and how it is to be understood. And he talks about a generation who grew up in the segregated South, who had no opportunities, and so on and so forth. And he says, they came of age in the late 50s and early 60s, a time when segregation was still the law of the land and opportunity was systematically constricted. What's remarkable is not how many failed in the face of discrimination, but rather how many men and women overcame the odds. How many were able to make way out of no way for those like me who would come after them. Yeah? Make a way out of no way. So, the refusal to accept the structures of power that would have all black people corralled within certain notions of and parameters of mediocrity. Just one last quotation, if that is correct. Yeah, one last quotation and then I'll go on to something else. Now, right through the speech, while Obama is conscious of race, racism, black anger, white anger, and so on and so forth, he is also conscious of, and here he echoes the idea of the American dream, the need to look forward. He says, for the African American community, that path means embracing the burdens of our past without becoming victims of our past. Yeah? The necessity, as he puts it, of having a memory of the past, but not being victims of that past, not being burdened by that past. And this is a very complex interplay, and something that the black community today is dealing with. Obama is not the first public figure to have talked about it. Bill Cosby, for instance, or in a different framework, Will.i.am of the Black Eyed Peas, they're all considering the ways in which black communities need to take responsibility now for their condition. Which does not mean, of course, that black communities become innocent of the structures of race and violence. The structures of law, for instance, which are increasingly being used to roll back some of the advances that were made during the 1960s in terms of the resegregation of schools, for instance. So, a constant interplay, if you will, between the necessity for racial and historical memory, and at the same time, as Baldwin and Obama in very different contexts put it, the necessity for valuing oneself and taking oneself forward with that additional burden of being black in America. Now, I've spoken a lot about the African American condition, because the African American condition in many ways helps to contextualize and to critique and to problematize this idea of America as a place of possibility and individual plenty and hope. There is another framework which I want to touch on very briefly. And this is related, of course, to the idea of the frontier. Now, I'm not going to go into the conceptualizations of the frontier, but one of those ideations of the frontier is a masculinist concept. White colonists landing in the United States, what is now the United States, landing in what they believe to be a gift from God, and clearing the wilderness of its natural resources and also of the people whose land it is, in order to fulfill the mandate of their God. Now, this masculinist conception of the frontier, of course, you find in James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales, of which at least you may be familiar with The Last of the Mohicans, if not the book, at least the film. Yeah? Now, in Leatherstocking Tales, you will remember Natty Bumppo, Hawkeye, is the quintessential white settler colonial. He is friendly with the natives when necessary. He's as good as the natives in his ability to live with nature and to practice the kinds of violence that the Native Americans are capable of practicing. He's friends with Chingachgook, for instance, and you notice this immediately. Chingachgook's body is a disabled body, whereas Natty Bumppo's body is, of course, a masculinist one, is stereotypically masculinist one. Now, violence in this framework of the frontier was justified. It was necessitated on the basis of the need to protect women and to protect civilization. And if you're interested in this, you can have a look at many new historiographers of captivity narratives, for instance, which talk about this. Susan Faludi, in a wonderful book called The Terror Dream, analyzes how what America is doing in the war on terror actually goes back to these early depredations, which are a part of settler colonialism in the North American landscape. Now, in many of the captivity narratives, as Faludi and others have pointed out, women did not wish to be protected. They were quite happy being with their native protectors, many of whom they married, and they didn't wish to come back. Now, that, of course, profoundly troubles and disjoints this idea of a community of special white people, particularly and vulnerable women who need to be protected. What is particularly, of course, discomforting for white men was not only their own cowardice, many of them ran away when the Native Americans attacked, but the fact that their women were capable of violence. Right? So there are various layers here. But I want you to consider, in this context, Hester Prynne in Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, which in many ways, as has been argued, provides the possibility or perhaps a dream of a gendered alternative. You remember in The Forest, she tells Dimmesdale that her relationship had, as she says, a sanctity of its own. What we did had a sanctity of its own. So she not only refuses to accept a kind of gendered bounding of possibility, but she articulates that in sacred language. She sacralizes that. What we did had a sanctity of its own. Yeah? And the boundaries, the fact that she becomes, despite the fact that she does not run away, because she realizes that running away is not a solution, the fact that she becomes a kind of prophetess, realizing the ways in which masculinist, patriarchal, discursive frames don't protect women. They oppress women. So that the promise of America then, the American dream from a gendered perspective, again, as in the case of African Americans or other minority groups, but in different contexts, is very different. Now, one of the things underlying this entire conceptualization, whether political, ideological, or commonsensical, of the American dream is the premise of exceptionality. Yeah? We are a people of exceptional virtue. Yeah? We go out into the world to save them from all kinds of evils like communism and terrorism and everything else in between. And as has been argued, only an exceptionally virtuous nation perpetuates the types of exceptional violence that the white settlers and their descendants perpetrated. And this has been one of the seminal studies of this is by Richard Slotkin, Regeneration Through Violence, which is now a commonplace study. But Slotkin's argument, he points out how throughout the settling of the West, as it were, the regeneration through violence trope continues, and the premise of that is exceptional virtue. Now this, of course, takes us to a further interconnected idea, which is the idea of America as a haven for immigrants, yeah? Which it has been for many. However, race and racial othering are inherent in this concept. And as I said earlier, within this conceptualization of America as a melting pot or a salad bowl or whatever you will, in that popular commonsensical notion of America, white is non-political, white is non-ideological. Yeah? And as has been pointed out, for instance, in a wonderful book called How the Irish Became White, it's not about color. Yeah? It's about structures, again, as I said earlier. It's about structures of labor, structures of capital, and, of course, structures of violence. But this whole idea of white as being outside the ideological charge of race and racism is what George Lipsitz calls, in a wonderful book of his, the possessive investment in whiteness. And it is that possessive investment in whiteness that actually defines Americanness. So if we have to think about the American dream, the commonsensical notion is a white notion. Yeah? And occasionally, as a matter of political correctness or popular culture deference, you have Disney productions with Native Americans and so on and so forth, just to show that we are all in this together. But as a matter of policy, you find exactly the opposite. Just to give you two very well-known examples, one is the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1896, I think, and about 50 years later, less than 50 years later, the internment of Japanese American citizens during the Second World War. And of course, slavery, we all know. Yeah? It's interesting and obvious that in the context of slavery, we're not talking about immigrants at all. There are, of course, black communities in the United States who did immigrate, but they came from Jamaica and elsewhere. But the slaves did not immigrate, they're forcibly brought here, and then, of course, they make it their land. But the possessive investment in whiteness continues, and it has been suggested, and I would agree with that, that while one may disagree with, say, Barack Obama's policies, many of which are problematic, some of the over-the-top criticism is based precisely on this possessive investment in whiteness, because there is this black family in the firmament of what has been white. Yeah? Even though in fundamental ways, President Obama has not challenged any of the structures that continue to bedevil black communities. So, just two speculations, and these are based on two theories you are familiar with. One is from Frederick Jameson. The speculation is, so why is this narrative so popular? Why is this phrase, the American dream, available and commonplace for all of us, yeah? Even non-Americans? Frederick Jameson theorizes that when we look at texts, we ought to consider not just the ideology, which of course we must, but as he says, their utopia. And by their utopia, what he means is their desire for teleological narratives, for completeness. So the telos of America, in that sense, is ever into a better future. And that telos can never be questioned. If you question it, you're questioning the fundamental premises of the basis of the imagining of America. So that utopic desire which lies at the heart of America. And finally, wonderful phrase that Pierre Macherey uses in his study of fictional narratives when he talks about the fictional resolution of ideological conflicts. It is not that ideological conflicts have never existed in the United States. They have existed from the point of the first settlement. And right through, there have been ways of resolving these ideological conflicts. And the American dream, I would suggest, is one such fictional resolution of a deep-seated and essential ideological conflict at the heart of America.